The auctioneer had asked 3 times and gotten nothing back, and the lot he could not sell was not even in the pen. 41 head of unhandled Mustang blooded mares, the broken bits last, running loose in the lava breaks north of town. As they stand, he read, wherever they stand, buyer gathers. The county was selling a right to catch, and no man along the freight yard rail believed that right was worth $1, because nobody alive could gather them. Harlan Voigt said it loud enough to carry both directions that the only bidder left was a widow wide as the freight doors and about as much use. Somebody called out 9 cents. Verna Prine had both hands flat on the rail. $9, she said. The laugh took the ring. It ran the length of the rail and up onto the loading dock and came back around, and the auctioneer had to bang his hammer twice on the post before he could hear himself repeat the number. If this story has hold of you already, subscribe and stay with me to the last word of it and drop the city you are watching from into the comments, because I want to see how far Verna Prine travels tonight. And keep that laugh in your ear, because 9 years from this afternoon the men making it will be drawing her wages, and the United States Army will be paying her price without one word of argument. She paid out of a handkerchief knotted at the corner. 4 silver dollars first, laid flat on the clerk's plank, then the rest in dimes and half-dimes gone warm from being carried against her, counted out one at a time into Ezra Tull's palm while the rail waited for her to come up short. She did not come up short. Tull was the bank's man in the town, dry and exact, ink on both cuffs, and he took the coin without letting his fingers touch hers and made the entry in the auctioneer's sale book in a clean bookkeeper's script, reading it aloud while he wrote, because he was enjoying it. Wild scrub, 41 head, ungathered, of no value. $9. Sold to the widow Prine. He turned the book around so she could see the line. She read it through once and did not ask him to change a word of it, and that surprised him enough that he watched her longer than he meant to. She folded the bill of sale into a brass-cornered tally book she carried under her arm, put the book inside her coat, and walked out of the ring, and the ring let her go. Everything worth having had already gone under that hammer before she opened her mouth. The broken bits saddle stock went first. 61 head of broke geldings a man could look at in a pen and put a number on, and they brought good money and went fast. Then the deeded bottomland along the creek, 3,000 acres of it with the hay meadows and the barn and the water rights, and Lyle Stannard bought that standing still, with one finger lifted for less than it was worth, because the county had a rule about not bidding against Stannard that nobody had ever written down. Then the wagons, then the harness, then the anvil, then a crate of horseshoes by the pound. And then, at the bottom of the sale, when the crowd was already loosening and men were counting what they had spent, the auctioneer read the last lot and could not give it away. The betting started before she was clear of it. That was the point of the betting. Voigt had a boot up on the bottom rail and his thick neck red from the sun, and he was a horse dealer who had never in his life been happier than he was with an audience. 2 weeks, he said. She would be back on the North Road inside 2 weeks, walking, and he would buy her rope halter offer for $1 out of charity. Tull took the summer off her instead, which the men liked better because it was crueler and it sounded like arithmetic. 1 winter, he said. She had $9 worth of horses she could not catch, and no hay, and no roof, and the country would take her the first hard week of January. Lyle Stannard did not bet. He had bought the broken bit an hour earlier. The name, and the deeded bottomland, and the stockyard at the railhead, all of it for cash. And he stood a little apart in dove-gray broadcloth, with his silver beard combed, and his hat pale and clean in all that dust. When Voigt put it to him, Stannard looked north a moment, toward the rock, and said that the country would settle it. Then he touched his hat brim and went to see about his pens. It cost him nothing. Somebody wrote the bets on the back of a bill of lading and stuck it behind the glass at the freight office, and there it stayed for 9 years, and that is the reason we know the exact words. Here is what none of them knew, and none of them could have known it, because not one man at that rail had ridden north to look at the cinders in 10 years. They knew the name of that country, and they knew it was worthless, and both of those things had come to them out of the same place, from other men, standing at the same rail. Sedalia, Missouri, 1866. The Remount farm sat 4 miles out of town on bottomland her father had bought back after the war with money he did not have, and the string on it was run by a 12-year-old girl, not helped with. Run. The Army bought there twice a year, and twice a year the buyers came down the lane in their blue coats and asked for the man of the place, and the man of the place walked them out to the lot and then stood back and let his daughter do the talking, because she was the one who knew what was in it. She was big at 12, taller than the hired men's sons, and broader through the shoulder than any of them, and she had already worked out that this was information other people used against her and nothing else besides. She could throw a saddle up one-handed at 11. She could hold a 2-year-old's head down with her weight alone when the farrier needed it held. But the size was never what her father traded on. What he traded on was that she could stand at a rail and watch 40 head move once across a lot and tell him which 4 were sound, which 1 would break down at 8, and which 2 would carry a trooper through a Kansas winter without going ugly about it. She read horses. She could not have explained how. She looked at hocks and feet and eye and the set of a hip, and she knew. And by 13 the buyers had quit asking her father anything at all. The spring she was 14, a captain came down that lane wanting 30 head and offered a price that would have paid the note, and her father had his hat off already. She cut 19 out of the lot and told the captain that was what she had. The captain said he could see 40 horses standing behind her. She said he could, and then she told him what was wrong with the other 11, one at a time, out loud, in front of her father and 2 hired men and the man's own sergeant. A splint that would come sore on a hard road. A mare that would not stand to be shod without a war and would therefore go barefoot in Kansas and be dead by autumn. 2 that were sound and would never be honest, which was a thing she could see and could not prove. The captain bought the 19 and paid over the price he had offered for 30, and he came back the next spring and asked for the girl by name before he got down. Her father did not thank her for it that evening or any evening. He put his boots up and looked at the fire and said that the 11 were still eating, and she said she knew what the 11 were eating, and she went and got the book and showed him, to the penny, and that was the last argument the 2 of them ever had about a horse. He put her on the tally book at 12. Brass corners, a spine already broken soft, and his rule written on the inside board in pencil, every head that comes on, every head that goes off, dated, sire and dam, and price. Not a memory in the world is worth a line of ink, he told her, and he told her one time. She wrote in it every day for 18 years. She wrote in it the afternoon he was buried, and she wrote in it the week after the sale at the rail, and there was no page in it. First to last, with a lie on it. He kept one other rule, and he kept it without ever once giving a reason for it. Anything new that came onto the place stood 40 days by itself, on its own water, on its own grass, before it ever touched the main band. Its own bucket, its own bit, its own bedding, and the bedding burned after. He had lost a place in the war years, before Sedalia, and the sickness that took it was never named out loud in that house, only kept out of it. 40 days apart. She might have taken it for a superstition, except that in 18 years she never saw a horse of theirs go down with anything, and the neighbors did, and she was 12 years old and already keeping a book, and a book will teach you what a story cannot. So she kept the rule. It cost grass, and it cost time, and it never gave her a single thing she could point at, and she kept it anyway. The other thing Missouri taught her she could not have named as a lesson at the time. It was this. Her father did not get rich, and he was the best horseman in that county, and the reason he did not get rich was that he bought horses. Men brought him horses, and he bought the good ones and sold them at a fair profit, and he did that for 30 years and died square with the bank and nothing more. The men who got rich in remounts did not buy horses. They bought creek bottoms and hay meadows and the springs at the head of a draw, and then they let other men's horses walk to the water and charged $4 a head for the privilege of catching them there. Her father saw it plain. He sat at once at a rail watching a contractor's wagon go by loaded with new posts. "Anybody can buy a horse," he said. "The trick is buying where the horses are going to be." Then he went into his supper and never mentioned it again, and his daughter, 14, stayed at that rail another hour in the dark. She married Emmett Prine in 1879 because he was quick and warm and he laughed at things, and because he was the only man in 3 counties who did not seem to find her size worth a remark. He was a horse trader. He was a good one, as a trader is good, which is not how a horseman is good. He bought in Nebraska and sold in Wyoming, bought in Wyoming and sold in the Territory, and in 5 years he never held ground longer than a season, and he never once let her set the price. That was the whole of the marriage in a sentence, and she had never said the sentence out loud to anybody. He was not cruel. He asked her opinion often and took it about half the time, and the half he took made money, and neither of them ever remarked on that either. In November of 1883 he went into a corral after dark to catch a green 4-year-old that had come in that day, without a lantern, because he had done it 1,000 times. The horse killed him. It was not the horse's fault, and she never said one word against that horse for the rest of her life. It was dark, and the animal was frightened, and Emmett was in a hurry, and hurry in the dark around a green horse gets settled one way. By spring the paper had caught up. A trader lives on other men's money, and when the man dies, the money wants to come home. They took the string. They took the wagon and the harness and the good saddle. They took the house in March, which had never been theirs to begin with, and when it was all counted, Verna Prine, 29 years old, standing in the yard of a place she no longer had a key to, owned $49, a rope halter over her shoulder, a canvas coat, and her father's tally book. No family, no employer anywhere in this world who remembered her fondly enough to write a line for her, because she had never worked for anybody but her father and her husband, and both of them were in the ground. She got through the rest of that winter on other men's floors and other men's problems. There was work for her if the work was ugly enough. A liveryman in Glendive had a mule nobody could shoe, and she shot it in an afternoon for $2 and her dinner. And he asked her to stay on and muck stalls at $1 a week, and seemed to feel he was being generous. A rancher's wife south of the river hired her to nurse a colicked stud through 3 nights and paid her in a coat. 4 different men in 4 different towns told her, kindly, in the same words almost exactly, that she ought to think about cooking, because there was always work for a big woman in a kitchen, and a horse outfit was no place for her. She said thank you to every one of them. She was not bitter about it. Bitterness is a thing you spend, and she had nothing to spend. What she had instead was a want, and it had gotten very simple over that winter, and it came to 3 things. Ground of her own. A brand of her own. And no man's permission ever again for anything. She came into Rimfire on the North Road 3 days before the sale. The notice had run in 4 papers, and she had read it standing up in a hotel lobby in Miles City. And what caught her was not the mares. It was 5 words down in the terms, as they stand, wherever they stand. She was on the road that night. She did not go into the town when she got there. She went past it, north, up the wagon track and into the rock, and she rode the cinders alone for 2 days with a blanket and a sack of crackers and a hobbled horse she had rented for $1 a day, and nobody in that county knew she had done it, and nobody ever thought to ask. What she found up there was black lava, broken and ledged and running for miles in low shelves, with sage and bunch grass standing in every pocket between the shelves, cured on the stem, sweet, untouched. The footing was dry and sound, and it rang under a hoof. The draws ran deep and crooked, and they broke the wind from every direction a wind can come from. And in the shade, under the ledges, in 2 places she found, and heaven knows how many she did not. Water came up out of the rock in a seep and stood in a basin the size of a wagon bed, and it did not run off anywhere, and it did not freeze, because the rock around it held the day. She counted horses for 2 days, not the mares. She never laid eyes on the Broken Bit's mares at all, which she took for a good sign, because if she could not find them in 2 days, then Stannard's riders could not find them in a month. She counted the wild ones. The first band came down to the South Seep in the evening of the first day while she was lying flat on a ledge above it with her chin on her wrist, and she watched them water for half an hour from close enough to hear them drink. A dun stud, wide across the chest, walking the rim of his own band. 11 mares and 4 foals of that year, and every foot on every one of them was hard and black and unbroken, because they had been growing up on rock since the day they were dropped. Not one of them stood over 14 hands. Not one of them had ever been hungry, either, in the middle of a country the county called dead. They drank, and they lifted their heads, and they went back up the draw at a walk, unhurried, and the stud stood on the rim above her, 30 feet off, and looked a long time at the shape of her lying on the rock and decided she was rock. Bands of 8 and 11 and 20, duns and grullas and bays with the old Mustang bone in them, watering at dusk and drifting back up into the draws, and she made her tally on the last page of the book and ran the arithmetic twice, and the arithmetic said there were somewhere near 800 head of unclaimed horses running loose on that public range, and every last one of them belonged to whoever could hold them. The county had a name for it. The county called it the Cinders, and the county called it worthless, and the county was right about that for exactly as long as you believed a country was made out of grass. On the second evening she got down off the rented horse on a rim above the north draw, and the sun went, and the cold came up out of the sage the moment it did, and she put her bare hand flat on the black rock. It was warm. Not cool. Not going cool. Warm, an hour after sundown, the whole ledge of it, holding the day inside itself and giving the day back all night long into the pocket where the grass stood. She kept her hand there a long while. That was the thing. That was the entire thing, and no man at the freight yard rail had ever put his hand on it, because you cannot see heat from a horse, and you certainly cannot see it from a hotel porch in town. Horses do not die of cold in that country. They die of wet cold with no windbreak, no feed, and bad footing. This rock had all 3 of those covered, and it had water that would not ice, which meant the mares had not been dumped up there by the Broken Bit, and they had not wandered into it by mistake. They had been born in it. It was theirs. And a horse born in a country will come back to that country from 100 miles out, walking, with no help from anybody. So the terms were not a joke. The terms were the only honest thing said at that sale. Buyer gathers. Nobody could gather 41 wild mares off 90,000 acres of lava with rope and riders and a month, and Wade Kittredge had proved it, and 6 men had proved it, and Stannard was not fool enough to try. But nobody had to gather them. You do not gather a horse in that country. You hold the water, and you wait, and the horse gathers itself. And then your mares are standing in your trap on your seep, and in June a wild stud will bring his whole band down to that water because your mares are standing in it. He will bring them to you for free. 800 head of free, year after year, as long as you own the wet places. 41 Mustang-blooded mares held on their own water was not a lot of scrub. It was a magnet with a bill of sale on it. She had not bought 41 culls at that rail. She had bought the key to a country, and it had gone for $9 because the key was invisible and the door looked like rock. She never explained a word of that to a living soul. Not that day and not for 9 years. She had learned young that a thing explained to men at a rail becomes a thing men at a rail can put a price on, and the only reason that lot was hers for $9 was that not one of them had gotten down off his horse and touched the ground. She rode out the same afternoon she bought it, on a mule she had traded her rented time into, with everything she owned tied on behind. The canvas coat, one skillet, a sack of oats she could not really afford, the rope halter, the tally book, and $40. 9 hours later the wagon track quit, and the rock started, and she came up the mouth of the North Draw in the last of the light. And there was a man sitting on a lava shelf beside the trail with his elbows on his knees. Tall, raw-boned, dark, unkempt beard, a brown range coat worn through at both cuffs, a battered hat, a saddle on the ground beside him, and no horse anywhere in sight. He had been the Broken Bits horsebreaker. The outfit had gone down under him while he was standing in the middle of it, and he had drawn no wages since February, and he had not left, because there was nowhere in particular for him to go, and the rock did not care whether he was on it or not. He looked at the mule, and the skillet, and the woman. He did not get up. "They can't be gathered," he said. "I heard. I tried. 6 men and a month. We got 2. I know." She looked past him, on up the draw, where the ledges stepped back and the shadow was already lying blue in the pockets, and something a long way up there was moving that might have been horses and might have been nothing at all. Then she asked him the only question she had for him. "Where do they water in August?" His head came around. It took him a moment. Nobody had asked him a question about a horse in a year, and nobody in his whole working life had ever asked him that one. "North Seep goes brackish by the middle of July," he said. "Every year. They quit it. They'll walk 7 miles to the south one, and they'll keep walking it till the rains come. All of them. Every band on this rock, and the mares along with them." That was the answer. That was the whole country handed across in 4 sentences by a man with no horse, and he had no idea what he had just put in her hand, and she did not tell him. He knew where every animal on 90,000 acres would be standing on the first day of August. He had known it for 2 years. He had ridden that rock for an outfit that paid him to catch mares with rope and men, and had never once been asked the only question that mattered, and so he had never said it. Because a man who tells the Broken Bit that the whole country walks 7 miles south in July is a man explaining why he has failed. 6 men and a month. They had been chasing horses across the top of an answer. She had been dealing with horsemen since she was 11 years old, and she could count on her hands the ones who told her a true thing they had not been paid to tell her. Nobody said anything for a while after that. She got down off the mule, and her boots made a hard sound on the ledge, and she stood there in the last of it, looking at the south end of the country, with her hands hanging and her hat pushed back, taking a long time over it, and Wade Kittredge sat on his rock and watched her look. The light went red and then went out of the pockets, and the cold came up, and the rock did what the rock does. She crouched and put her hand flat on it. Still warm. It would be warm at midnight. It would be warm in January under a foot of snow, with a band of mares bedded down on it out of the wind, chewing bunch grass nobody had to haul, a quarter mile from water nobody had to dig. 41 head, she said. That's what I own. On paper. She stood and knocked the dust off her palm against her coat. Not one of them in my hand. The rock held its heat until the stars were out, and then began giving it back to the sky, and Verna Prine took her hand off it and said they would start at the water in the morning. 41 head on paper. Not one of them in her hand, and no pen in 40 miles that would have held them if they had been. Wade Kittredge sat where he had sat since the afternoon, at the mouth of the draw with his elbows on his knees and his hat down, and he did not ask her what she meant by the water. He had already told her that 6 men and a month could not gather those mares. He had told her the truth as he understood it, and she had no quarrel with a man for that. Her quarrel was with the men who had never ridden north to look and had priced the country anyway. She slept in the wagon bed under the canvas coat, and she was standing at the north seep before there was light enough to see her own hands. It was a shallow thing, a wet blackness in the shade under a ledge, seeping out of a crack no wider than her wrist and running maybe 30 feet down a bench of cracked lava before the ground drank it again. In April it was nothing much. In August it would be the only certain water within 9 miles, and the mares knew that better than any man in the territory did, because they had been foaled here and weaned here and had never in their lives drunk anywhere else. The track proved it. She got down on her knees on the wet gravel and read the ground for an hour while the light came up gray and then rose-colored, the deep old cut of a mare walking slow with a foal beside her, the sharp-punched crescents of a young horse coming in fast and scared. Hooves overlapping hooves in a fan that spread wide out from the water and narrowed as it came back to it. 100 years of horses had walked that fan. She could have laid her hat over the place where every one of them had put a forefoot down to drink. Wade came up behind her with the 2 saddle horses and stood there. She did not look up. "How many waters north of here?" she said. "In August." 3, he said. "Maybe 2. "Which 2? He was quiet a moment, working it. "This one," he said. "And the south seep at the bottom of the long draw. The rest go to mud by the middle of July, and the mud goes to dust by the 1st of August. She stood and beat the gravel off her skirt with the flat of her hand. 2 waters. 41 mares who could not leave 2 waters, and 800 head of wild horses running the same rock who could not leave them either. In Missouri her father had put it in 5 words when she was 12 and wanted to chase something. You do not catch horses. You catch water, and then you wait, and the horses catch themselves. The wing fence took 3 weeks, and it took her hands apart doing it. There was no wire to be had and no money for wire had there been any, so she built it out of what the country was made of, which was dead juniper and broken lava. The juniper stood in the draws in gray twisted skeletons, sun-cured, light, hard as iron, and it came out of the rock with a chain and a horse and a good deal of swearing that she did not do. She dragged the trunks down and laid them butt to crown in a long curved line running out from the seep, a 1/4 mile of them, and built the low places up with stone. The stone was the worst of it. Lava breaks along dirty edges, and it takes the skin off a hand where a rasp only polishes, and by the end of the first week her palms were a mess of small black cuts that would not close, and she wrapped them in strips off a flour sack and kept lifting. She was a big woman, and she used it. She could get a hand under a rock that 2 men would have stood and argued about and walk it up onto the wall herself, and she did that 11 hours a day for 3 weeks while the light lasted, and on the 8th day she looked up from a stone she had just set, and Wade Kittredge was on the far end of the line, laying juniper exactly as she had laid it, working toward her. He had not said anything. He did not say anything then. Either he had told her it could not be done, and now he was doing it, and he never once said he had been wrong, and she never once asked him to. The fence was not a fence. That was the part the town would not have understood had it ridden out to look, which it did not. It enclosed nothing. It was 2 long, soft wings that started 3/4 of a mile out in the open sage, so far apart that a horse walking between them would never feel anything narrowing, and it drew slowly in toward the water and the rock corner behind it, and it stood low enough that any mare in the territory could have stepped over it if she had ever once thought to look at it as a wall. They never did. A horse coming to water down a trail her grandmother's grandmother wore into the rock does not look at a line of dead juniper. She looks at the water. All that fence had to do was stand there for a year until it was part of the country, and then be there on the one morning it mattered. Solomon Hake came out in May. He came because she sent Kit Mabry down the road with a message, and because nobody in the town would give him a day's work. He was 60-some and small, and weather-blackened and clean-shaven, hawk-nosed, squinting out from under a shapeless sheepskin coat he wore in weather that had no business supporting it, and his right arm ended at the wrist. The livery had told her he was a drunk, which was a lie, and that he could not lift, which was true, and she had not said either word back to them. When he rode up on a borrowed mule, she did not ask him what he could lift. She asked him what he knew. He sat there and looked at her a while, and something in the leather of his face moved and settled. "I shod for the cavalry 11 years, he said. "I know feet. I know when a horse is lying to you about being sound, and I know when a man is lying to you about a horse. You know this rock? I know rock like it. 50 a month and your food," she said. "I have not got 50 a month. You will get it in the spring, or you will get a horse instead and pick the horse yourself." Hake got down off the mule and looked at the wing going out into the sage and said nothing at all for a long minute. Then he said, "Where do you want me to start?" He could tie a knot with a hand and a stump faster than Wade could tie one with 2 hands. He could hold a hind foot between his knees and rasp it level with the fingers of the one, and he never once mentioned the arm, and neither did she, and the first man who would have made a joke of it never got the chance, because there was nobody out there but the 4 of them. The town did what the town did. She rode in the first week of May for staples and nails and 40 pounds of flour, and the dry goods man counted her money twice and then said he could not carry her on the books. She had not asked to be carried on the books. She had asked for a keg of nails and put the coin on the counter. He said it again anyway, louder, so the 2 men by the stove would be sure to hear it, that he could not carry a wild horse outfit on the books, and one of the men laughed into his coffee. She picked up the nails and put her change in her pocket and thanked him and rode out, and behind her Harlan Voigt was telling the freight yard that the widow had gone out to the rock to feed coyotes, and that it was hard luck on the coyotes since there was that much more of her than of most people, and they would be at it until Christmas. His 2 weeks came due in the middle of May. Nobody at the rail collected, and nobody mentioned it, because a bet like that is not a bet. It is a way of saying a thing out loud in company and being agreed with. She heard about it because Kit told her. Kit Mabry was 14 and had no people and mucked the livery for his board and slept in the loft over the buggy shed, and he had stood at that rail in April and laughed with everybody else, because a boy laughs when the men laugh. He rode out the first Sunday in May on a livery horse he had no business having to look at the wild ones. And he stayed all afternoon holding the end of a rope while she set Juniper, and he was back the next Sunday, and by the middle of June he was coming out 3 and 4 days a week on his own time and doing a man's work for nothing but supper. She never asked him to come. She fed him and taught him, and did not once tell him he was too young to be of use, and he began repeating things she had said down at the livery as though he had thought of them himself. And that was how the town got its first news of the outfit that had not come out of Voigt's mouth. The first mare came in on the 9th of June. Verna had put a hobbled bell mare on the water in the last week of May, an old bay-grade mare, sensible, bought for $11, the only horse she owned worth anything, and the only one she could afford to give away to the country. The bell mare grazed the bench above the seep and rang all day and all night and became, in the reckoning of the rock, simply another horse living where horses live. On the 9th of June a bay with a white speck on her near shoulder came down the fan at 3 in the afternoon and drank, and looked at the bell mare and grazed 40 feet off her, and was still there at dark. They let her be. That was the whole of the work. They let her be. Verna sat up on the rim with the tally book on her knee and watched a horse drink water and wrote nothing down, because there was nothing yet to write. On the 11th there were 2. On the 16th there were 5, and the bell mare had them out on the bench in the evening like a hen with chicks, and Wade rode a mile out of his way going home so as not to cross the fan. On the 28th of June they shut the gate on 11 Head, and the gate was a panel of juniper that Hecke dropped in from behind a rock with a rope, and there was no chase, no dust, no shouting, no man on a horse waving a hat. 11 mares stood in the rock corner and looked at the juniper and then went back to eating. Wade sat his horse on the rim a long while, looking down at them. "I ran these mares 2 summers," he said at last. "I ran them for the broken bit until I had 2 horses down and a man with a broken leg." She let that sit. "They were never running from you," she said. "They were going to water. You were only in the road." July did what she had told nobody it would do, and paid the $9 back with an interest no bank in the territory would have written. In the second week the country dried out hard and fast, and the mud holes went to dust, and on the 15th a wild stud came down the North Fan at noon with his whole band strung out behind him, 19 head, mares and colts, and a 2-year-old filly favoring a foot. Because he had no other water within 9 miles, and because there were mares standing in that one already, and a stud goes where mares are. He came in high-headed and screaming, and stood on the bench and made his noise for an hour, and Verna sat on the rim, with her hands on her knees, and let him. He drank. He brought them back the next day. By the end of the month 3 bands were using her seep as though they had been born to it, which they had. And she owned every one of them from the moment she chose to close a gate, because the terms of the sale said as they stand, wherever they stand, and the country said the rest. She had not bought 41 culls. She had bought a door, and the country was walking through it. She wrote the July count in her father's brass-cornered book on a page that already had his hand on it from 1870, and she told nobody in the town, and the town went on telling itself that a fat widow was starving in the Rock. There was one thing wrong with all of it, and she had known it since the day she read the sale bill, and it stood 14 hands high. A Mustang is a small horse. 14 hands, 14 and a half if she is a good one, hard as a hammer and sound as a stone, and she will carry a man from here to the Missouri on grass and spite, and do it again on Tuesday. No army on earth will buy her. The Army wants 15 hands and better under a trooper with a carbine and a saddle and 60 pounds of kit. A stage line wants size in the collar. A freighter wants bone. 100 good little mares standing in a lava corral are 100 head of nothing at all unless something puts size on what they throw, and her mares could not do it, because her mares were the country, and the country was 14 hands. She needed a horse that was not from here. She had $4 and some coin left of the 49 she had come in with, and a wagon, and a rope halter, and Emmett's watch. The horse was in rimfire, and had been for a year, standing in the last stall of the livery in the dark, and every man in the county knew about him, and not one of them would open the door. He was a dark bay, 17 hands, thoroughbred and Morgan, 9 years old, bred in Kentucky by somebody who had known exactly what he was doing and then handed to somebody who had not. He had been beaten across the face with a chain by a man in a hurry, and he had put that man through a stall wall, and he had been sold and sold again and shipped west with a paper on him that said unsellable, and the livery kept him because he had been left there against a bill nobody meant to pay. They forked hay over the door. They watered him through a hole. In a year he had not been out of that stall. Verna stood in the alley and looked at him over the door for 2 hours on a Thursday and did not go in. He came at the door once, all of him, and the whole building moved, and the liveryman behind her said something about the glue works. She looked at his hocks and his shoulder and the flat bone under his knee, and she looked at his eye, which was not a mad eye, whatever the town believed. Then she went and found the man who held the paper on him. She put Emmett Prine's silver watch on the table and $40 beside it, which was every coin she had in the world and a winter of flour she would not be eating. The watch had a dent in the case, and it had stopped at some hour on a November night, and she had never had it fixed and had never wound it since, and she pushed it across the wood without looking at it. The man picked it up and turned it over and said it was a fine watch. She said it kept nothing worth keeping. He wrote her a bill of sale on the back of a feed ticket, and she folded it into the tally book, and she never spoke of the watch again, not that year and not after. That was Friday. By Saturday morning half the town knew the widow had bought the killer, and by Saturday noon there were 30 men and boys along the corral rail behind the livery, and Voigt had come down from the freight yard, and somebody had brought a bottle, and 2 men were taking money on how far she would get. They had come for a spectacle, She did not give them one. What she did was carry an upturned water bucket in through the alley door, set it in the dirt 3 feet from the stall front, and sit down on it. She had the rope halter over her shoulder, and she did not take it off her shoulder. She sat there. The horse hit the back wall and blew and rolled his eye at her, and she sat there. After a long while, she took out the tally book and wrote in it. At noon, Kit brought her bread, and she ate it sitting on the bucket. At dark, she got up and went to the wagon and slept, and at first light, she was back on the bucket. The crowd on Saturday was 30. On Sunday, it was 15. By Monday afternoon, it was Kit, and Wade standing back in the alley door with his hat in his hands, and one old man with nowhere else to be. She sat on that bucket 3 days and said almost nothing, and what she did say was not to the horse, it was to Hake about feet. On the third evening, the stud came to the front of the stall and put his head over the door and did not do anything with it, and she did not raise her hand or her voice or her eyes, and she went on sitting. On the fourth morning, she stood up off the bucket, unlatched the door, put the rope halter on him without hurry, and walked him out down the alley into the sun, 17 hands of him, and he blinked and shook himself once, and she walked him to the trough and let him drink while the whole street watched a woman hold a rope. There was nothing to see. That was what nobody could tell right afterward, in the saloon or anywhere else. You could not make a story out of it, because nothing had happened. She named him Bishop, for the way he moved in a straight line and would not turn aside, and she had him bred to 9 mares before the leaves came off. Lyle Stannard rode out on the 18th of September alone on a good gray gelding, in dove-gray broadcloth, with the dust of 6 miles on his polished boots and a heavy chain across his front. He was 58 and prosperous, and wore the full silver beard of a man who has been consulted about things for 30 years, and he came up the draw at a walk, with his hands crossed on the horn, looking. He stopped at the outer end of the north wing, and sat 5 minutes before he came on, and when he rode up to where she was setting the last rock of a water gap, he took his fine pale hat off and put it back on, and said the first honest thing anybody from that town had said to her since April. "That is a well-built wing," he said. "Whose notion was it?" "Mine. I would have said a man built it. I would have been wrong." He looked down the quarter-mile of juniper and stone, and out at the bench where 40-odd head grazed loose above the seep with the bell going slow, and he looked a long time, and there was nothing in his face but a horseman looking at horses. "You have them coming to the water," he said. "It cost me a year of my life to learn this country would not hold stock. It appears I did not learn it. You never came up here." "No," he said pleasantly, "I did not." Then he took out a folded paper and did not hand it to her, only held it, and said the thing he had ridden 6 miles to say, and he said it the way a man says a kindness. He would give her $20 for the lot as it stood. She would have doubled her money in 5 months, better than the bank paid, and she could take it to Helena or Bozeman or back to Missouri and keep a house or a boarding table, and she would not be here in February. He said the last of it with no relish in him at all. He said this rock had killed better outfitted men than her, that a woman alone in it would not see spring, and that he would rather not read about it in the paper come March. It was the truth as he saw it, and he saw it clearly, and that was the whole trouble with him. She straightened up with the rock still in her hands. "No," she said. "Thank you." 3 words, and she set the rock in the gap and turned back to the wall. Stannard sat there a moment. He did not argue. He did not threaten her, and there was not one thing in his face or his voice she could have carried to anybody as a threat, and she stood with her back to him and understood precisely what that meant. A man who threatens you has decided you are worth threatening. He touched his hat brim to her back and turned the gray and rode down out of the draw at a walk, and she listened to the shoes ringing on the rock until she could not hear them, and then she set the next stone. They came for the brand on the 1st of October. She had thought about it for as long as it takes to ride home from town in May with a keg of nails and a laugh in your ears, which is to say 5 months, and she had not needed one of them. They had laughed at $9. Then let the whole territory say $9 every time it said her name. Let a buyer in Helena and an agent in Miles City and a captain in a fort say it. Let it be burned into 4,000 hips if she lived that long. She was not going to spend one day of her life ashamed of the best trade anybody had made in Bannerman County in 10 years. The $9, she said. And Hakey grunted, and Kit said it twice over to hear how it sounded, and Wade Kittredge looked up from the fire with something moving behind the flat of his face that never got as far as his mouth. The iron was a straight bar with a hook made by a one-armed farrier over a juniper fire on the 2nd of October, and it burned a single 9, and it went on the left hip. They ran the bay with the white speck on her shoulder into the chute first, because she was the first head ever gathered on that water. Hake heated the iron and read it and turned it and did not hurry. Kit held her head and talked nonsense to her. Wade held the rope. Verna set the iron herself, 3 seconds, 1 clean 9, and stepped back, and Hake looked at it and said it was a good mark. And that was every word spoken. The mare got up and shook, and walked off into the pen, and put her head down and ate. They ran 40 more that day, and 60 the next week. The snow came on the 6th of November, early and thin and mean out of the northwest, and it did what she had bet $9 it would do. It fell on the black ledges, and it did not stay. The rock had been drinking sun since April. Down in the valley on the broken bits deeded bottomland, the drifts were already building against the fences, and up in the breaks the south face of every ledge lay bare and dry with the bunch grass standing out of the pockets, and her horses walked out of the wind into the draws and ate. She rode the rim in the afternoon with the wind coming across, and stopped where she could see the whole of it, the pens, the bench, the seep in its shade, the bell mare with her ears back, the gathered bands strung out along the south face, and Bishop by himself on the high ground because he would not stand with anything. She got down. She sat on the rock with the tally book on her knee and took the pencil out of her pocket and counted them as her father had taught her to count, in sixes twice, and got the same figure both times. She wrote the date. She wrote 38 of the 41, and the 3 that were not, and where she believed each of those 3 had died. She wrote 55 head gathered off the free range, and where each band had been taken and on what day. She wrote 1 stud, 17 hands bought. She added it and looked at it and said it out loud, once to nobody, in a flat voice the wind took away. 94 head. 6 miles south at the freight yard rail, Voight's 2 weeks had been dead in the ground since the middle of May, and no man there had said one word about it, and Ezra Toole's 1 winter had begun that morning. She put the pencil back in her pocket, closed the brass corners on the book, and laid her hand flat on the ledge beside her, and it was warm, and it was snowing. Snow came to the breaks in the last week of November and lay 9 days. And on the 10th morning she rode the rim with the tally book buttoned inside her coat and counted 94 head standing in the bottom of the north draw with their heads down, pawing bunch grass clear for themselves under 6 inches of dry powder. 94 was the figure she had written at first snow. 94 was the figure standing in front of her now, and she sat the horse a long while and let herself look at it. The lava ledges above the draw were bare and black in a white country. Snow did not lie on them. It fell, and it went. And by noon the rock along the south face was warm enough to steam, and by dark it was still giving that heat back down into the pocket underneath, and the mares had known it before she did. They drifted up against the ledges at sundown and stood there through the worst of the cold, with the wind going over the top of them and never touching a hair. She had put her hand flat on that rock in April and read a whole winter out of it. And the reading had been right, and being right in April did not feed anything. Being right in March would. December went to 30 below on the 3rd night, and the seeps did not freeze. That was the thing she had bet $9 on, and it was the thing nobody else had ever ridden north to look at. The water came up out of the shade at the foot of the black ledges at whatever temperature the ground kept the year round, and it ran 20 feet and steamed and went under the rock again. and in the morning there was an open hole in the ice with mud churned around it and 40 horses waiting their turn. Wade Kittredge chopped ice one time that winter at the Low Seep on the coldest morning of January, and when he came in he said it had not needed chopping and he had done it to be doing something. She said that was a good reason and did not say anything else, and Solomon Hake laughed into his sheepskin collar with his one hand hooked in his belt. They lost 3 head between the first snow and the grass. An old Gralla mare went down in a crack in the rock on a black night, and they found her in the morning, a colt of the year before bogged at the Low Seep and was dead when Kit Mabry got to him, and one bay simply was not there anymore. And Hake said she had gone to a lion up in the Rimrock, and Verna wrote her off in the tally book with a line through the entry and the date beside it. 3, she had put a pencil to it in October and figured on losing 15. That difference was the first fact of the empire, and nobody in the county knew it but 4 people, one of whom was 14 years old. In March the wind came around out of the southwest and rotted the snow off the flats, and the town began hauling. Not hay. Horses, the valley outfits along the river bottom, had wintered their stock in the open on grass that a foot of wet snow had sealed over like a lid, and they came out of it dragging. Verna sat her horse at the edge of the freight yard on the 17th of March, with the halter over her shoulder, and watched a 4-up drag a stone boat down the alley with 2 dead geldings on it, and the man driving was a good man who had done nothing wrong except believe the country was the same everywhere in it. Harlan Voigt was on the rail with his thumbs in his vest, and he saw her looking and said loud that the widow had come to town to buy hides. Nobody laughed the way they had laughed in April. Nobody told him to hush, either. She rode home that afternoon by way of the North Draw, and her mares came up out of the pocket to look at her, ribby along the top and hard through the middle, in flesh, ugly with winter hair, alive, 91 head. The foals started on the 11th of April and were done by the middle of May, and there were 19 of them on the ground, wild stud get. Sired out on the range the summer before she ever owned their mothers. She caught every one inside its first week, put a hand on it, haltered it, and turned it back to its dam, and Kit asked why bother when they were too little to be any use, and she said a horse that has had a hand on it at a week old never learns to be afraid of one. And that is the whole of it, and it costs nothing but the walk. Then she measured them. She had a stick with a crossbar Hakey had made out of a wagon spoke, and she measured every foal at the withers and figured it forward against the tables her father had kept in Missouri, and wrote the number beside each entry in her small square hand. 14. 14 and a hand. 14 and 2. Not one of them, grown out to 5 years old and fed all the hay in the territory, would ever stand 15 hands. She wrote that down, too. 19 head of sound, quick, tough, honest little horses, worth $10 apiece on any range in the West, and worth exactly nothing to the only buyer that mattered, because the government of the United States would not put a trooper on a 14-hand horse, and never had, and never would. She sat on the rim that evening with the book open on her knee and the arithmetic lying there plain, and that was the entire reason a 17-hand dark bay stud who had not left a stall in a year was standing in her corral eating her hay. Bishop covered 38 mares between the 1st of May and the middle of July, and he did it quiet, on a rope, one at a time, in a pole pen, with Wade at his head and Hake at the gate, and nobody got hurt, and nobody was ever going to. In May the country gave her the first thing she had not worked for. A wild band came down the south draw to her water in the last week of the month, 31 head with a roan stud on the tail of them, and they came because her mares were standing in that seep, and a horse that lives in rock will walk 5 miles to stand with other horses in wet ground. She did not run them. She did not touch them for 11 days. She let them drink and learn the wing fence and drift out and come back, and on the 12th day she and Wade and Kit put the panels across at dusk and had the whole band inside by dark without a rope thrown. And the roan stud went over the low wall and out and left his mares standing there, which was the only piece of luck she got that year and the only piece she needed. 26 mares, 4 young geldings, 1 yearling filly. And then she did the thing that made Hake stare at her the same as a man stares at a stove that has spoken to him. She put them on the low seep, 4 miles from her main band, on their own water, in their own pocket, with their own buckets and their own ropes, and she left them there 40 days. No horse from the North Draw came within a mile of them, no bucket crossed between, no bit, no halter, and no man who handled them went back to the main band without washing to the elbow and hanging his coat outside. 40 days. Hake looked over the grass they were eating and told her plainly it was a waste of it, that she had 4 miles of good bunch in that pocket she could be holding back for winter, and instead she was letting 26 head stand around in it, doing nothing whatever. Kit said it was strange and asked her twice what she thought was going to happen to them. She said her father lost a farm in Missouri in the war years and never once told her which disease had done it, only how to keep it out, and that she had been keeping it out since she was 12 and did not intend to learn the other way. That was all she said about it. She went back to the wing fence, and Hake went back to his forge, and the 40 days ran out, and the band came onto the main water clean, and the whole business was so unremarkable that by August nobody on the place remembered discussing it. It was simply how the $9 took horses in, like latching a gate behind you. In June, the railroad let a contract for a spur grade running 11 miles west out of the railhead, and the outfit that got it came in with scrapers and no stock to pull them, because a greater remuda dies on its feet, and no man who owns good horses will hire them onto one. Verna rode to their camp on a Sunday and did not sell them anything. She hired them 40 head of her wild-caught geldings at $10 a month a head, and she hired them Kit Mebry at $15 a month to go along with the horses, and the paper she wrote on the tailgate of their wagon said her rider handled her stock, that no man of theirs put a hand on a head of it, and that any horse worked lame came off the grade the same hour. The camp boss signed it because he had scrapers sitting idle and no choice at all. 5 months, 40 head, $2,000, and she got every horse back with more education in it than had gone out, and 31 of the 40 went on to be harness stock worth $60 a head, which is arithmetic no man in the freight yard ever bothered to do. She wrote the 2,000 in the back of the tally book on the money side, under a line that had $149 on it and nothing else, and she looked at the 2 figures sitting together a moment, and then she shut the book. The Seeps brought her 4 more bands before the grass cured, 61 head between the 1st of July and the middle of September, and every one of them stood its 40 days on the low water before it ever put a nose in the North Draw. 202 head went into the second winter. In the last week of September she rode to town, sat in the land office 2 hours with her hat on her knee, and filed on 160 acres at the mouth of the North Draw under the homestead law, 5 years residence, no money down. Then she paid $160 in gold and filed a desert land entry on 640 acres at the South Seep. The clerk asked her twice whether she understood a desert land claim wanted proof of irrigation inside 3 years, and she said she did, and he wrote it up, and she signed both, and it cost her $160 and 1 afternoon. Ezra Tull was at the bank window across the street, and he watched her come out of the land office and did not think about it again for 2 years. 800 acres. Nobody in the county could be brought to care. Riding home in the dark, Wade asked what she wanted with sand and rock she could not run 50 head on, and she said the 2 claims held the 2 waters. And he said yes, and rode another half-mile, and then she felt him get it beside her without turning to look. There was no other water between the North Draw and the breaks above the Milk River Road. None. Not a spring, not a tank, not a live creek. She had ridden every foot of it in April of 1884, and she had ridden it twice since. 90,000 acres of public range lay out there free to any man alive, and it was worth precisely nothing to any man who could not water a horse on it, and the mouths of the 2 draws were the only doors into it. She had just bought both doors for $160 and a signature. She had fenced 90,000 acres of the United States without a mile of wire, and she had done it in a land office in front of a clerk who yawned while he wrote. Wade said, after a long while, that a man could ride past that country his whole life. He said men had. That winter they broke horses, and it was the second thing the county never troubled to learn about her. Wade Kittredge had come up in outfits that broke a horse in an hour with a snubbing post and a slicker and 4 men on the fence hollering, and he had been good at it, and it had cost him a collarbone and most of his sleep. The first morning she handed him a rope halter and told him he had all winter. He looked at her a while. Then he took the halter. They ran 30 head at a time through a pole chute into the low pens and did nothing to them for a week but walk among them with their hands down. Then the halter. Then a foot. Then the other 3 feet. Then a blanket. A collar. A set of dead traces dragged in the snow. A stone boat. A mate. A hitch. Nobody rushed. Nobody got hollered at. A horse that shied got backed up 2 steps to where he had been easy and started again from there, and Verna would take a whole afternoon off a colt's education and give it back the next day and be ahead of where she would have been. Hake shod them cold and sharp for the rock. Kit sat on the rail after his chores and watched, and by January he was walking among them with his hands down, and by February he had a colt following him around the pen with no rope on it at all, and he did not know she saw it. They put 90 head through that winter and never used a snubbing post once, and on the last day of it Wade stood at the gate looking at a pen of quiet horses and said the whole thing had taken 4 times as long. She said it had, and asked whether he wanted to do it the other way next year, and he said no, and that was the end of the discussion and the beginning of everything the stage line bought. The foals of 1886 started on the 2nd of April, and there were 31 of them, and they were bishops. They came out long-legged and coarse-headed and awkward with too much leg under a Mustang body, and they got up on those legs inside the hour. Because their mothers had been born in rock and had never in their lives had a soft place to lie down. Hake came along the pen the first week and stopped at a dark bay colt out of a dun mare and ran his one hand down the front of the leg, thumb and fingers closing around the cannon bone below the knee, and held it there while the colt leaned into him. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "That is not a Mustang's leg. That will carry a man in armor." He turned it loose and went on down the line and looked at 11 more and said nothing about any of them, because he had already said it. Verna measured every one and wrote the figure down and did not celebrate, and that evening she wrote a second line under the count, 4 years old in 1889. She could not have told anyone why she wrote the year. A horseman writes down when a colt becomes a horse. In April, Lyle Stannard stopped being kind. He did it the way a capable man does a piece of business, without heat and without one word said to her face. She had 30 broke harness horses ready that spring, and she sent Wade in with 6 of them to stand in the Saturday ring at the stock pen, and the auctioneer took the entry and then handed it back to him at noon and said there was no room on the card. Wade stood in the alley with the 6 horses 4 hours and brought them home. The livery would not take her stock on consignment. The freight yard had no pens, the pens were full and stayed full and were empty every Sunday when nobody was looking. The dry goods sold her thread and would not sell her nails. Nothing was refused. Everything was merely unavailable, and every man who made it unavailable was a decent man who had known Lyle Stannard 30 years and had never once known him to be wrong about a horse. That was the whole of his method, and it was better than a gun. He had bought the Broken Bit's name and its bottomland and its stockyard at the same sale where she bought her mares. He had held the Army's remount contract 9 years running, and when he stood at the rail and said mildly that he did not care to see the country's buyers taught to bid on wild scrub, the men at the rail heard a lifetime of being right. He never told a lie about her. He never needed one. He rode out to the fence once more that spring, sat his horse a quarter hour, looked over her band, and told her the fence was good work. Then he touched his hat brim and rode back and closed the last 2 doors on his way through town. She watched him go, and she was not angry, because anger is a thing you spend, and she had a use for everything she had. He had not left her a market in Bannerman County. Nobody had told him she needed one. In July, she went around him. The stage line's division station lay 61 miles south and east on the far side of the county line, and the line ran 4 coaches a day up the North Road, and a harness horse on that run lasted 18 months, and they bought 100 head a year. And they bought them out of Cheyenne because the territory had never sold them a horse worth the freight. Verna cut out 48 head, geldings and mares, wild caught and made, 4 years old and better, every one of them halter broke, and gentle, and hitched, and driven, and sound, and she and Wade and Heike and Kit put them on the road on the 9th of July and drove them 61 miles in 3 days without a horse of hers touching another outfit's water. And she walked them into the station corrals at noon on the 11th with the dust still on them. The division agent was a small gray man with his spectacles pushed up on his forehead, and he came out and looked at 48 horses standing quiet in a strange corral in a strange country with their heads down and not one of them running the fence. And then he looked at the big woman in the canvas coat who had brought them, and then he did what a man of business does. He hedged. He said he had heard some talk out of the railhead. He said he did not deal in wild scrub. Verna said she would leave the price entirely to him if he would take a hitch out on the road first. Harlan Voigt was standing in that yard when she said it. He had 4 horses in the line's corral himself, sold that spring, and had come down about selling 4 more, and he laughed and told the agent to put the widow's hitch against his and see whose was still walking at the end of it. He said 100 miles of the North Road would tell the whole story about her. The agent looked at Verna. Verna said 100 miles was fine and asked one thing only, which was that the same driver drive both. They ran it on the 15th and 16th of July, 2 4-horse hitches, empty coaches, 100 miles up the North Road and back to the second station, one driver taking the first hitch out and another bringing the second along behind, and then trading at the turn so no man could favor his own. Voigt's 4 were fine big horses out of the Cheyenne trade, $75 apiece, 16 hands, good-looking enough to stop a man in the street. They ran the first 30 miles beautifully. At 40, the road climbed onto the black flats, where the rock comes up through the dirt in ledges and the ruts run over the top of it. And Voigt's off-leader began to short his stride, and at 60 a hind shoe came apart, and by 75 he was going on 3 legs and a hope. They came in at dusk on the second day, with 2 of the 4 ruined, and one of those never sound again. Verna's 4 came in walking. They came onto the station yard at a road trot, with their heads up and their ears going, and the harness marks in the sweat, and the driver said one thing when he stepped down, which was that he had not touched the brake on the black flats because he had not needed to. They had been foaled on rock. They had spent every day of their lives setting their feet down in a country that punishes a horse for guessing, and there was not a lesson in 100 miles of the North Road that the Black Flats had not already taught them for free before they ever wore a collar. Verna said none of that. She let the 4 horses say it, standing in the yard, breathing easy. The agent walked around them twice. Then he took his spectacles off and cleaned them on his sleeve and said, "I will take every head you can break." He wrote the 48 at $60, $2,880 cash on the counter out of the line safe, and he signed a contract for the next season, 100 head at $60, delivered at the station 1st of June and 1st of September in his own hand, and gave her the copy, and she folded it into the tally book against the back board. Voigt went home the next morning with 3 horses and a bill from a farrier. He got louder that autumn, not quieter, and told the freight yard the test had been crooked, and the men on the rail listened, and 1 or 2 of them rode north that fall to look at the cinders for the first time in 10 years, and came back and did not say much. Verna put the $2,880 in Tull's bank on the 2nd of August, and Tull counted it twice, and his face did not move, and he wrote her deposit into his book in his own precise hand with the ink on his cuff, and she watched him write it, and thanked him, and went out. Something happened in that room, and neither of them acknowledged it. He had bet one winter in April of 1884. It was 2 winters gone. Autumn came into the breaks in the 3rd week of September and turned the bunch in the pockets the color of a new rope. Kit Mabry was 16 that fall, and he took the South Gather himself, 4 days, with 2 boys off the grade he hired out of his own wages, and brought in 19 head of wild stock without a horse hurt, and put them on the low seep for their 40 days without being told. And Verna wrote his name in the book beside the entry as the gatherer, which was the only wage that mattered to him, and both of them knew it. The 2 Waters had drawn 125 head in off the free range between April and the end of October, Kit's 19 among them, and the 48 that went to the stage line had gone out of the count in July. And the 31 Bishop Foals had come into it in April, and none of that was luck, and all of it was in the book. Wade was riding at her stirrup by then. It had come on so slow she could not have named the month it happened, but he had spent 2 years at the edge of things, sitting on rock, standing at the shadowed end of a corral with his hat in his hands. And now when they rode out at daylight he came up out of the yard and fell on a half-step behind her left knee and stayed there all day, and when she stopped, he stopped, and when she looked at a piece of country, he looked at what she was looking at instead of at her. He still said nothing that was not about horses. She had never asked him to. On the last day of October, she rode the rim at sundown with the book open on her knee and the light going long and red down the black ledges. And she counted the fall gather and the summer's foals and the higher stock in off the grade and the 2-year-olds and every mare in every pocket, and she carried the figures down the page and added the columns twice, because she added everything twice. And then she wrote the total at the bottom and said it out loud to nobody, because Hake was at the forge, and Kit was asleep, and Wade was standing 40 feet off with his hat in his hands looking at the same country she was. 310 head. 2 years and 6 months from a knotted handkerchief and $9. She put her hand flat on the rock beside her, out of habit now more than reading, and it was warm. And down in the north draw a mare called, and another one answered her. And that same week at the bank in town Ezra Toole opened his ledger to the $9 page for the 3rd time in a month, and sat looking at it a while with his pen gone dry in his hand. On the morning of the 9th of June, 1887, there were 349 head standing under the 9 on the $9, and 112 head standing in 2 dead juniper traps up in the breaks that wore no iron at all, and Lyle Stannard knew what the difference was worth before Verna Prine did. She was up on the north rim at first light with the tally book open on her knee and Kit Membry beside her counting the 2nd trap out loud, and she saw the riders come over the sand ledge in a line, 8 of them, moving at a working trot with their ropes down and a loose remuda behind them, and she knew from the shape of it that they had not come to talk. They did not come at her. They swung wide of the rim and dropped into the sand draw where the May band was standing its 40 days apart on its own seep, and by the time she had come down off the rock, they had the Wingate off its posts and the whole band strung out south toward the wagon road. Kit put his heels in. She said his name once, not loud, and he stopped. Wade Kittredge came up the draw at a long trot with his coat open and his hat back and reined in beside her and did not say anything, and the 3 of them sat their horses and watched 112 head of her horses go down the road at somebody else's pace. The dust hung a long time in that country. There was no grass under it to hold it down, only black rock and sage, and it stood up off the wagon road like a wall until the wind came at noon. She watched until she could not see the last horse, and then she turned her mare and rode into town at a walk, because a horse ridden hard into rimfire tells the whole freight yard something, and she had nothing she wanted to tell them. The notice was already printed. That was the part she made herself look at squarely, standing in the freight yard with the paper in both hands and the ring of men at the rail behind her, going quiet. It was set in the same column as the hay prices. By authority of the territorial statute concerning estrays, the county gave notice that 112 head of unbranded horse stock, taken up at large upon the public domain in the county of Bannerman by riders in the employ of the Broken Bit, were held in the Railhead stockyard at Rimfire, and would be advertised and sold at public auction for the account of the finder unless lawfully claimed within 30 days. It had been set in type before the riders ever left the yard. She read that off the date at the head of the column and the wet gloss still on the ink, and she understood the whole of it then, standing there with the paper going soft in her hands. He had not stolen anything. He had not come at her with men or fire or a lie. He had read the statute, and the statute was old, and it had been written for a country full of stock that wandered, and it said in plain words that unbranded horses running at large on the public domain belonged to nobody until somebody took them up and told the county he had. Her 2 May bands had been caught, thrown into juniper traps on the seeps, and left standing there 40 days before they touched the main band, or the iron, which meant that for those 40 days they were, on paper, exactly what the statute described. He had not invented that. She had handed it to him herself, and she had handed it to him with the one piece of discipline she had never bent in her life. Harlan Voigt said from the rail, loud enough to carry, that a person could not brand what a person could not catch, and somebody laughed, and then almost nobody laughed, because it had stopped being funny in that town about a year ago, and the men there were still learning the new arrangement. Verna folded the notice in half, and then in quarters, and put it inside the front cover of her father's brass-cornered tally book, and put the book in her coat, and got on her mare. Ezra Toole stood in the bank door with ink on his cuffs, watching her. She touched her hat to him, because in 3 years she had never once given that town the satisfaction of a hard word. Then she rode north, and the whole rail watched her go, and every man there believed he knew what she was riding home to do, and all of them were wrong, because they thought she would either break or come back with men, and she came back with paper. She was 5 days in the county's books, and she did not tell anybody why. The clerk's office was a room off the back of the freight agent's building, with a stove nobody had lit since April, and a smell of dust and mucilage. And the clerk was a young man who had never been asked for anything in his life and did not know how to say no. She asked for the sale book. He brought the whole shelf. Sheriff's Sales, Bannerman County. And there it was, the April of 1884 column in the auctioneer's own hand with the clerk's beside it, and she found the line without hunting for it because she had been carrying it in her chest for 3 years. Wild scrub, 41 head, ungathered, of no value. $9. Prine, above it, in the terms of the lot, written out because the auctioneer had made a point of reading it twice from the block that day, so that no man could come back afterward and say he had been sold a pig in a poke. As they stand, wherever they stand, buyer gathers. She sat down on the clerk's stool and read the whole page. Then she read the lot above hers, the deeded bottomland, and the name, and the stockyard, sold to Stannard L., and she read the terms on his lot, and his lot said, delivered. Hers said, buyer gathers. That was the difference the county had written down itself, in its own book, in its own hand, 3 years before anybody had a reason to care about it, and it was worth more than every lawyer in the territory. She had the clerk copy both pages and certify them, and wrote his fee in the tally book, because she wrote everything in the tally book. Then the brand inspector's records. 9 years of them, the Broken Bits tallies, under the old outfit and under Stannard both, every gather that outfit had ever reported in the county, and not one of them. Not one in 9 years north of the wagon road. Not a horse. Not a mile. The country had been sitting up there full of horses the whole time, and the outfit that now claimed to have found her stock at large on it had never once ridden up to look at it. She had that copied, too. Then she went to see the auctioneer, who was crying a mixed lot of harness and hardware at the freight yard, who had a good memory and no stake in it, and she asked him one question, which was whether he recalled what he had read off the block that day. He said he did. She asked if he would put his hand to it in front of the board, and he thought about it for as long as it takes a man to look at his own book, and said he would. He said his book had never been wrong yet, and he was not going to start letting men be wrong out of it. Solomon Hake wrote his statement at the kitchen table in the stone barn, with the paper held flat under the stump of his left wrist and the pen in his right, and it took him an hour and a half, and it was 4 sentences long when he was done, and it said where the May bands had been caught, and on what days, and by whom, and that he had watered them himself every morning since. Kip Mabry, 17 that spring, wrote his, and it was longer and better spelled than anybody expected, and it named the seep and the date and the count and the color and sex and rough age of every head in the second band, because he had made his own tally that day and copied it over fair. Wade would not write. He came into the barn and stood at the end of the table with his hat in his hands and said he could put his mark on it. She said his mark was as good as any name in the county. He made it, and Hake witnessed it, and that was the first time in 3 years anybody had watched Wade Kittredge's face do anything at all when a woman spoke to him. The hearing was the 2nd of July in the upstairs room of the freight agent's building, because there was no courthouse in that town yet. It was 96 degrees in there by 10 in the morning, and there was one window, and it did not open. The county board sat 3 men behind a plank on trestles. Stannard did not come. He sent his man, a soft-spoken attorney out of Miles City in a linen coat who had a fine reading voice, and who laid the statute on the plank like a man putting down a full hand, and he was not wrong about a word of it. He read it out, and then he talked for 11 minutes about principle. He said the estray law existed so that the range would not become a thing where every man simply claimed whatever ran in front of his door. He said that if unbranded stock on the public domain could be taken by whoever said he had caught it, then the range in this territory would go to whoever could shout the loudest, and that his client took no pleasure whatever in the matter and would return the horses gladly the moment a lawful title was shown, and that no lawful title could be shown, because there was no iron on them. It was a good argument, and 1/3 of the men in that hot room were decent men who had ridden a long way because they honestly believed the range needed protecting from exactly the thing he had described, and Verna sat and listened to it with her hands in her lap and did not find one lie in it, only a hole. Then the board asked the claimant if she had anything. Verna Prine stood up. She was in a plain dark work dress with the sleeves pushed up and her hat in her left hand, and she had no attorney and no speech, and she put the tally book on the plank and opened it, and she read out of it in a flat voice, the same voice she used on the rim at account, and she never once got above it. She read the terms of the lot off the county's own certified page, twice, because the auctioneer had read them twice. She said the county sold her the loose stock of that country by that lot, on terms the county wrote itself, and the terms said gather, and that if gathering was not how a person took title in that rock, then the county had sold her nothing at all in April of 1884 and owed her $9, and she would take the $9. Somebody at the back made a noise. The auctioneer stood when they called him, said what the terms had been, put his finger on his own book, and sat back down. She read Ezra Toole's line next. She did not look at Toole when she read it, and Toole was in the room. She read it exactly as he had written it, wild scrub, 41 head ungathered of no value, and then she said that the man who wrote that line and the men who had agreed with it were all standing at the same rail that day, and that not one of them had been north to the breaks in 9 years. She laid the brand inspector's certified pages on the plank, 9 years of them, and said the broken bit had never reported a gather north of the wagon road in the whole time the county had kept the book, and that a man cannot find a thing in a place he has never been. Then the tally book itself, and that was the part that ended it, though it took the room another 40 minutes to understand that. She read every head of the 2 May bands out of it. Not the count. Every head caught the 14th of May at the Sand Seep brown mare aged Scar-off 4, dam of the Bay filly foal caught with her. Caught the 14th of May, bay stud colt, 2 years, off the same band. Caught the 16th of May at the South Trap, gray mare, 6 years, sound, gentle to the halter by the 20th. And on, and on. In a hot room, in that flat voice, for 112 head, every one with the day and the water and the man who roped it and the man who watered it after. The attorney objected twice at the start and then quit objecting, because there was nothing to object to. It was a woman reading a ledger. By the 40th head the board had stopped taking notes. By the 80th the room had gone the particular kind of quiet where men are doing arithmetic they did not intend to do. She finished and closed the book and said that the statute said at large, and that a horse standing on its own water inside a trap she had built with her own hands, watered every morning by name for 40 days, tallied and dated and witnessed by 3 men, was not at large. And that if it was, then there was not a horse in Bannerman County that was not, including every head in the Broken Bit stockyard. Then she sat down. The board took 40 minutes. They gave her the 112 head back and assessed the taker up her costs, which came to $219.40. And she wrote that figure into the tally book on the plank in front of all of them before she left the room. Stannard was waiting in the shade at the bottom of the outside stair with his fine pale hat on and both hands folded on the head of his stick, and he stepped aside for her, and she stopped, because it would have been small not to. He said she read well for a horse catcher. She said the county wrote it, she only read it back. He looked at her a moment with those pale eyes, and then he touched his hat brim and walked off toward the bank. Unhurried, courteous, and it cost him nothing that anybody standing there could see. She stood in the heat and watched him go. He had been right about horses for 30 years, and one hot room does not undo 30 years. She branded every head on the place inside the month. That was the whole of what she had to say about the hearing, and she said it with an iron. Hake ran 3 fires at the North Corrals, and they worked from Cansee to Cantsea for 11 days. Kit on the head, and Wade on the ropes, and Verna threw the iron herself on every one of the 112, and the 9 went on the left hip while the horse was still standing in the quarantine trap on its own water. Hake said she would hate herself for that a hot iron on a horse that has not settled will cost her in flesh and in trust and in a month of gentling. She said she would rather hate herself than read another notice, and she did not move the horses in to the corrals to do it. She had bought those 40 days with a farm her father lost. She was not giving them back to save 11 days, so they carried the fires out to the traps in a wagon, and the discipline stood. And after 1887 no head ever came onto the $9 unbranded again. Not one. Not ever. They rode home from the hearing in the dark, the 2 of them, at a walk, 12 miles of wagon road, with the rock giving back the day's heat on both sides of them, and neither said anything for the first 8 miles, which was ordinary. Then Wade said, "I quit being ashamed out here." That was all of it. 6 words, and he did not turn his head to say them, and he said nothing else for the last 4 miles, and she did not either, because there was nothing she could have put next to it that would not have been smaller than it was. She looked over at him once. He was riding a half step behind her shoulder where he had been riding for about a year without anybody deciding it, his hat down and his hands quiet on the reins, and something behind the flat of his face had gone loose and stayed loose. The notice out of Fort Kilbourne came down the Milk River Road in August, tacked up in the freight yard in the livery and the bank, and printed twice in the paper, because the paper had never had news that size. The Army's Remount Board would sit in the Territory in the spring of 1889 to contract for cavalry horses, and Captain Reuben Ash of the Purchasing Department would inspect at the post, and the board would take, by its own published estimate, as many as 1,000 head. 1,000 horses out of one territory in one season. Nothing near it had ever been bought in that country. There were men standing under that notice reading it twice who did not care about horses at all, because 1,000 head at Army money is a bank, a store, a hotel, and a railroad spur, and every man in Rimfire could feel the shape of it through the paper. Lyle Stannard, had held the remount contract 9 years running, and by the second day, the town had made it 10. Voigt told the Rail the only question was whether Stannard would deliver 600 or 8. Verna read the notice standing between 2 freight wagons with her hat down and her hands behind her, and she read the specifications printed under it in small type. Geldings only, aged 4 to 8 years, standing 15 to 16 hands, sound in wind and limb, halter broke and gentle to handle. Certified free of contagious disease. She read them twice. Then she rode home and up onto the north rim and got down and sat on the black rock with the tally book on her knee while the sun went and did the arithmetic, and it took about 4 minutes, and it came out the same both times. 19 foals on the ground in the spring of 1885, wild stud get, small, sound, and never going to make 15 hands, which was the whole reason she had traded a dead man's watch for a 17-hand stud in the first place. 31 Bishop-sired foals in the spring of 1886, 94 more in the spring of 1887 out of the mares she had held on that water since the first snow of the year she bid. Hake had run a hand down an 86 Colts cannon bone in the spring and said one sentence about bone, and she had written the sentence in the book. The 86 Colts would be 3 in the spring of 1889. The 85s would be 4. The 87s would be 2, and coming behind them, and the 88s behind those. She sat there and looked at the figures in her own hand and wrote nothing down, because there was nothing to write. She had built the exact horse the Army had not yet said it wanted, at the exact ages the Army had not yet said it needed, and she had started building it 3 years before the notice was printed, and she had done it because a 14-hand horse is a horse a person can only sell to somebody who is also poor, and she had never once intended to be poor again. She did not say any of it to Heike. She did not say it to Wade. She put the book inside her coat, got on her mare, and rode down off the rim to see about the hay. It came into that town in September behind a trail outfit out of the south, and it came in so quietly that for 2 days the only man in the county who saw it was a one-armed farrier who had seen it before. There were 14 head in the outfit's string, and they watered at the public trough at the head of the freight yard, where every horse in Bannerman County had watered for 11 years, and 2 of them had a running nose. Verna was in town for nails. She noticed because Solomon Hake had gone still beside her, and Heike did not go still. She turned to see what he was looking at, and it was a sorrel gelding standing hip-shot at the trough, with its head low and a wet gray streak from one nostril down the length of its face, dried and wet again over the top of itself, layer on layer, and a swelling under the jaw the size of a fist. The horse coughed. The man holding it swore at it and told the man beside him the whole string had picked up something coming up out of the south, and it would blow through. Hake did not answer him. Hake stood in the middle of that yard with his sheepskin coat hanging off his shoulders and looked at the trough for a long time, and not at the horse. He looked at the water. He looked at the men leading horses up to it 3 deep, and at the tin dipper on its chain that the freighters drank out of, and at the wet rope of the bucket, and his face did not change, and his color did. Verna said his name. Hake said one word. He had not said it since the war years, and he said it flat, with no weight on it at all. The way a man says a name he has carried so long, he has lost the strength to lift it. Glanders. Then he said they should go, and they went. They paid for the nails and left them on the counter, and neither of them said anything until the town was behind the first ledge, and then she asked him 3 questions, and he answered all 3 in under a minute. It moved on water and on shared iron. There was no test for it, and no cure. What a man did about it was a rifle and a fire and a fence. She had the water moved before dark. Not the main seeps, which she could not move and did not have to. The 4 hauling barrels the outfit kept at the wagon road gate for the men and the road horses, which had been filled out of the town trough since spring because it was closer than the north draw, and which sat where every rider coming home watered before he ever crossed her line. She had them dumped and burned. She set new ones at the South Seep and hauled from her own water, and she put Kit at the wagon road gate for a week, with orders that no horse that had drunk in town crossed onto the $9 without standing 40 days first, and no man crossed with a bit or a bucket or a rope that had been in that yard. Hake said it was too early to say. He said it might be nothing but strangles, and half the horses in the territory run a nose in September. She said that was true. She had the barrels dumped anyway. Then she got the book out and sat at the kitchen table and put it in writing. All of it. The 40 days. The separate water, the separate buckets and bits, the burned bedding, the lime plain and numbered, so that a man who could barely read could do it in the dark. And Hakeade stood at her shoulder and watched her write it and did not say one word about wasting good grass. They counted in the last week of October from the rim, the 4 of them. 3 days at it, Kit calling and Wade cutting and Hake at the trap gate, and Verna up on the Black Rock with the book. 349 head under the 9 at the start of June. 112 back off the stockyard. 560 head gathered off the breaks and the north country between June and the first frost, because by that summer her mares were standing in every water in that rock, and the wild bands had quit fighting the arrangement and simply come to it. Against that, 48 harness horses sold to the stage line at $60 a head, and a greater remuda of 24 to the spur, and 9 head lost to a lightning fire in July. She ran the column twice. She wrote the figure at the bottom of the page in her father's hand, which had become her own hand somewhere back there without her noticing it happen, and she said it out loud to Kit. Because he had asked, and because he was the one who was going to have to know it. 940. Kit said it back to her and rode off down the rim to shut the trap gate. Wade came up and stood at her shoulder and looked at the horses in the draws below, at the dust going up gold off 940 head in 4 bands on 4 waters, and said nothing at all. The sun went down behind the far ledges. Verna put her hand flat on the black rock beside her, and it was still warm, and 11 miles south in the freight yard the sorrel gelding with the running nose was standing at the public trough with its head low, and 40 other horses were waiting their turn behind it. 940 head had wintered on the Black Rock and come out of March in flesh, and Verna Prine spent the first warm week of April riding her water instead of counting them again. Solomon Hakey had stood at the public trough in town the autumn before and said one word he had not said since the war years, and he had not said it again since, and that told her more than a month of talk would have. She rode the North Seep first. She got down and put her hand in the water and studied the mud at its edge for the print of a horse that was not hers, and found none, and rode the 6 miles across to the South Seep and found none there either. And by the 4th day she had been around the whole rim of the cinders, and had marked 7 places in her father's brass-cornered tally book where a strange horse could come in and drink and go out again, and no man ever know it had been there. That was the shape of what was coming. Not weather. Not a storm a body could watch build up over the flats for a day and a half and have the stock in a draw before it broke. A nose that ran and would not dry. A bucket, a bit, a trough. Hake came out to the north draw in the 2nd week and sat his mule and looked at the 7 marks she had made on a sheet of paper, and did not tell her one thing she had not already half known, which was why she had hired him. The swellings come up under the jaw, he said, then the ulcers. Then the horse goes down and does not get up. He said there was no way to test a horse for it. There was a stock inspector for the territory, and there were the inspector's eyes, and there was nothing else, and by the time the eyes were sure, the trough had been working for a month. He rubbed the end of his wrist against his thigh where the hand had been, and said the rest of it plain. It travels on shared water and crowded pens, and a bucket carried from one pen to the next by a man in a hurry. There is no medicine. There is a rifle and a fire and a mile of empty ground, and that is the whole of the doctoring. She wrote it down. Not because she would forget it, because the tally book was where the true things went, and because a thing in ink could be handed to a man who would not listen to a woman say it. She closed the cinders on the 22nd day of April in 1888. There was no ceremony to it and nobody to see it done. Wade Kittredge hung a pole gate across the mouth of the North Draw in one morning and a second across the south. And they were not much of a gate. A determined horse would have gone through either one, and a determined man could have lifted the poles out in the dark. They were not there to stop anybody. They were there so that a man riding up had to get down off his horse, and a man who has to get down will talk to you first. She had Kit Mabry paint 2 boards and nail them on, and the boards said that no horse and no gear and no man off the town road came onto that ground without standing 40 days on the far water, and that the $9 would feed any man his 40 days for nothing, and pay him wages for the last 30 of them if he wanted work. Kit was 18 that spring, and had been running his own gather off the North Rim for 2 years, and he read the board twice and looked at her. "Men too," he said. "Men too," she said. He was in town 4 days later after nails, and he came back up the road at a trot with his hat in his hand, and she met him at the gate and did not let him through it. He had drunk out of a dipper at the livery. He said it like a boy who had broken a window. She sent him down to the line camp at the South Seep with a sack of beans and a side of bacon and a bar of soap, and she had his clothes boiled and his saddle blanket burned and his bridle scrubbed and hung in the sun, and he stood his 40 days out there alone and did not once ask her to shorten them. That was the first thing anyone in Bannerman County had seen of the discipline, and the story of it was in the freight yard before the boys' blankets were dry. Harlan Voigt got a good afternoon out of it. He told the rail that the widow had quarantined an orphan for taking a drink of water, that she had gone strange out there in the rock the way people did, alone, that she would be talking to the horses by August. Nobody in town believed the disease was what Heike said it was. It was distemper. It was strangles. It was a bad batch of hay out of the south. Every stockman in the territory had seen a colt with a running nose, and every one of them had seen the colt get over it. And a man who has been right about horses for 30 years does not stop the trade on one old farrier's word. The trade did not stop. It got faster. There was money moving that spring because the railroad had a spur crew, and the Army was letting it be known that a board would be buying, and the pens at the railhead filled and emptied and filled, and the horses came up from the south in strings and went into the pens and drank out of the trough that every other horse in the county drank out of. And that was that. Lyle Stannard ran his remount bands the way he had run them for 9 years, which was in a tight yard beside the tracks where he could feed and water 400 head with 3 men and a hydrant. And it was efficient, and it was cheap, and there was not a stockman in the territory who would have called it wrong. He was not careless. He was not a fool. He had built the best horse business between the Yellowstone and the line, and he had built it on the one thing that would not hold. In June, the trail outfit that had come up from the south in the fall lost the last of its string in a lot behind the depot, and the territory sent the inspector, and the inspector was in rimfire 11 days. Verna did not go in. She heard it from Heike, who went and stood with his hat on and his one hand in his pocket at the back of a crowd of men who had laughed at him in October, and Heike came back up the road slow and got down off the mule slow and said the inspector had condemned the yard. "All of it," she said. "All of it," he said. 430 head. He said the paper was posted on the depot wall, and that it named the yard and the pens and the trough and the water lot, and that it gave Stannard until the following Tuesday. They did it on a Thursday, on the far side of the ridge north of the tracks, in a coulee the county had used for a dump since before there was a county. She was 9 miles off and up on her own rim with a colt's foot in her lap, and she heard nothing at all, and she did not need to. Kit had gone to the head of the North Draw to look, and he came back at noon and sat down on the step of the stone barn and did not eat. The rifles worked all afternoon. That is all anyone in Bannerman County ever said about it, then or since. The freight yard went quiet at about 2 o'clock and stayed quiet, and the men who had been telling each other for 2 months that it was strangles stood around in the shade and looked at their boots. And by the middle of the next week, the whole town had agreed without a word ever being spoken that the subject was closed. Verna stood in the doorway of the barn at sundown with her hands hanging and looked down the road toward the smoke, and she did not say anything. And Wade came and stood at the corner of the barn a half step behind her and did not say anything either, and after a while they went and did the evening feed. She rode in on the Saturday. She went for lime, and she went to the bank, and she did not go for anything else, and she found Stannard sitting on the top rail of an empty stock pen with his fine pale hat upside down in his hands. He was not a young man, and had never pretended to be, and the silver beard was combed, and the gray broadcloth was brushed, and he sat there in the sun turning that hat around and around by the brim. The pens behind him were swept. Somebody had already thrown lime in them, too late by 2 months, and it lay in the corners in little white drifts. She got down. She did not say she was sorry because she was not going to lie to him, and she did not say anything else either, and the two of them were there a while with the flies working over the empty water lot. 9 years, he said. He said the yard had watered 400 head off one hydrant since the tracks came, and that it had never cost him a horse, and that he had put 9 years and a name and every dollar he had onto one trough because it was the sensible way to do it, and any man alive would have done the same. Then he said the thing that she did not answer. He said, "You knew in October." She had not known in October. Hake had known in October, and she had believed him, and there was a difference she was not going to stand in a stock pen and explain to a ruined man. She took Hake's paper out of the tally book, the one written out plain in the Farrier Square left-handed print, 40 days apart, separate water, separate buckets and bits, bedding burned, lime, and she folded it once and held it out to him. He looked at it a long moment before he took it. He put it inside the gray coat without reading it, and put the pale hat back on his head, and touched the brim to her the way he had touched it at the rail 4 years before when he would not bet, and there was no more in it now than there had been then. She got back on her horse. She had 11 other places to be that day, and she went to them. She had the paper copied 20 times. Kit did the copying at the kitchen table over 2 nights, in a boy's careful hand, and Heke could not write it himself with one hand quick enough to matter, but he stood over the boy and made him take out every word that was not needed, until it was 9 lines long, and a man could read the whole of it standing in his own doorway with the reins in his fist. Then she sent them out. Not for money, not for a horse, not for a favor, not for a promise of first refusal on anything a man had. Free, to every outfit in Bannerman County that ran fewer than 50 head, which came to 19 outfits, and Kit and Hake rode to all 19 of them between the middle of June and the end of July. She did not send the boy to hand a sheet of paper over a fence and ride away. That was the part the county remembered afterward, and it was the part she had learned at 12 years old outside Sedalia from a man who had lost a farm and never once told her which disease had done it. Anybody can hand you a paper. She sent lime with them. She sent 2 clean troughs off her own place on the running gear of a wagon, and the wagon went from outfit to outfit all summer. And when a man on the East Fork with a sheep camp and 11 horses could not read, Kit read it to him twice, and then stayed, and helped him dig his second water 40 rods from his first, and helped him scrub his buckets, and helped him burn a straw tick that the man had been sleeping on himself. When 2 brothers on the south bench came down with a mare that had a running nose in the second week of July, Hake was there in 5 hours and stayed 9 days, and the brothers lost the mare and did not lose the other 39. And they lost them not at all, because a one-armed man sat in their corral for 9 days and would not let a bucket cross a line he had scratched in the dirt with a stick. And she went herself, in August, when the crisis was over and there was nothing in it for anybody. That was the difference, and she never named it out loud. Half the county had come around by then, and the other half had not, and the ones who had not were the ones with money enough to be certain. The two big valley outfits on the bottomland would not take the paper. A man who runs 300 head does not take horse doctoring off a widow who catches wild scrub in the rock. And they said so pleasantly, and they were finished by September, the both of them. And the rifles worked twice more that year in coulees she never rode to look at. She did not say a word about it in the freight yard or anywhere else. There is no arithmetic that makes a burnt outfit into a good day. The year cost her more than anything since Emmett died. She shipped nothing. Not one horse went off the $9 between April and October of 1888, because nothing was moving in the territory and because she would not have hauled a horse of hers through that railhead for the price of the whole herd. The stage line's division agent, who had taken every head she could break for 2 seasons, wrote her a 2-line letter in May that said he was buying nothing out of Montana until the thing was over, and the harness contract that had put the first real money in the book went dead on the page. She kept feeding. She put up 400 tons of hay that summer off the meadows in the draws with 4 men and a boy and a mowing machine and a pitchfork. And there is no way to write that down and have it read like the 91 days it was. Her hands cracked open across the palms in July, and she wrapped them in flour sacking and went on. She burned lime money. She burned bacon money. In September she rode in and sat down across the desk from Ezra Toole with the tally book, and Toole had ink on his cuffs the same as always, and he did not offer her coffee, and he did not ask after her health. He read the book. He read every page of it, from the wild scrub line he had written himself in April of 1884 to the 400 tons of hay, which was the only place in the world that hay was written down. Then he took his glasses off and gave her 90 days on the note. He did not say he believed in her. He said the ledger said she was worth 90 days, and that he was not in the business of believing in people, and he wrote the extension out in his dry, precise hand and turned the book around for her to sign. She signed it, and thanked him, and went out. It was the only kindness Ezra Toole did anybody that year, and he would have told you it was not one. It ran the North Gather alone that autumn, 18 years old, and she gave him 3 riders and the north half of the rock, and did not go up there once, and he brought in 206 head off the free range in 6 weeks, and stood every one of them their 40 days on the far water without her ever asking him whether he had. And Wade stayed. That was the whole of it. He was the best hand with a green horse in that end of the territory, and every man in it knew it, and there was not an outfit between Rimfire and the line that would not have paid him double that summer to come and gentle what was left of their stock, and 2 of them sent men up the road to ask. He was standing at the gate when the second one came. She was 50 yards off, dragging a dead juniper out of a wing fence, and she heard the whole of it, because sound carries on that rock in the evening. The man made his offer twice. Wade said he was working. That was all he said. He did not say why, and he did not come and tell her about it afterward, and he did not look up the hill to see whether she had heard. And he was at the barn the next morning at 4 o'clock, the same as every morning, and she never mentioned it to him, then or after. She noticed. In the last week of October, the men began quitting. It came all at once, the way it does. A man who has buried a third of his string and has been told by the bank that a Montana horse is not collateral this year will take what he has offered and go back to Iowa, and there were 7 outfits in the county that autumn with clean stock standing on clean ground and no living soul who would buy a horse out of Bannerman County at any price. The horses were sound. The horses were worthless. In 1886, a broke 5-year-old off that same ground brought $60 in the pen at the railhead, and in October of 1888 there was no pen and no buyer and no bid. And a man on the East Fork offered her his whole string, 31 head, halter broke, at $4 a head, and stood there in her yard with his hat in his hands, waiting for her to laugh at him. She did not laugh at him. She gave him $32 a head. She went and got the tally book off the shelf in the barn and wrote his name and the date and 31 head at $32. $992, and counted it into his hand. And he stood in the yard and looked at the money, and then went out to the corral and told every one of those horses goodbye before he left the country. She bought 630 head that autumn out of 11 different outfits, and there was not one of them she stole. She paid about half of an 1886 price, and she paid it in money, and half of what she paid was borrowed on Ezra Toole's 90 days, and the whole of it came to $19,530, and every dollar of it is written in that book in her hand with the man's name beside it, which is more than can be said for any other fortune made in the territory that year. Not one of those 630 head touched her main band before it had stood 40 days apart on its own water with its own bucket on ground that had never had another horse on it. Hake had called that a waste of good grass in 1885. He was 70 years old now, and he was the one who stood the gate on the far water that autumn with a stick in his one hand, and he did not call it anything at all. She counted on the 1st of November from the rim above the north draw with the book open on her knee, and Wade held the horses, and Kit called the bands out of the bottom as they drifted onto the water below. 940 had wintered. 204 foals had hit the ground in the spring. Bishop sired every one of them, long-legged and big-boned, and already coming up past the withers of the Mustang mares that carried them. 430 head gathered off the free rock, hers by that lot and no other. 630 bought and paid for. 4 dead in the year and all 4 written down. 2 colts, a mare that broke a leg in the rock, and an old gathered stud that had never come right. She did the sum with the pencil, and then she did it again in her head, and then she said the figure out loud to the 2 men on the rim with her, which was the only audience it ever got. 2,200 head. There was not another string in Montana that year that had not been walked past a rifle, and every one of hers was standing in the bottom under a red sky, drinking out of water no sick horse had ever put its mouth in. The notice came down from Fort Kilbourne 3 weeks later. Kit brought it up the road in a rain, and it was a printed sheet, and it said that Captain Reuben Ash's remount board would sit at the post in the spring and would contract for cavalry horses, and that in consequence of the outbreak in the territory the board would inspect and buy only stock certified clean by the inspector, out of a band with no history of the disease and no shared water with a condemned yard. She read it twice, standing in the door with the rain coming off the eave, and then she carried it to the table and put it flat on the wood beside the tally book and sat down and worked it out with a pencil for a half an hour, which was all the celebrating she did. There was no certified clean stock left in Montana. There was no certified clean stock left in Montana except in the cinders. They cut the 600 out over the winter. Geldings only, 4 years old to 8, and she and Hake put a stick on every one of them at the withers and turned back everything that did not stand 15 hands. And the Bishop colts of 1885 and 1886 went through that stick like they had been ordered out of a catalog. 15-2, 15-3, 16 even on a few of the big dark ones. Wade had his hands on all 600 that winter, and Kit had his hands on all 600, and Heke shod what needed shoeing off a bench with a strap and a hook, and by March there was not a horse in that string that would not stand quiet while a stranger picked up its hind foot. The inspector came out on the 14th of March, and was there 4 days, and went through them one at a time with his hat pushed back, and did not find one running nose or one swelling under one jaw. And he wrote the certificate out at her kitchen table and dated it, and said it was the first one he had signed in the territory in a year that he did not have to think about twice. Stannard's wire went up the line the same week. He had no horses and no yard and no contract, and he still had 9 years of standing with the men who ran the roads. And the wire asked the post and the territorial stock board to close the Milk River Road to horse stock moving out of Bannerman County on account of the outbreak. And it was not a lie, and it was not even unreasonable. And it was the last card he had, and he played it. She heard about it on a Tuesday from Kit, and did not answer it. because a wire is answered with a wire, and she did not have 9 years of standing to spend, and what she had was 600 head and a certificate and 90 miles. They pointed them up the North Road in the last week of March in 1889 at first light. 600 geldings out of 2,200 head, 4 to 8 years old, 15 hands and better, halter broke, and gentle to handle and certified clean. Bishop sired out of 41 wild mares that had been written up in a clerk's book as of no value, and the point riders were a one-armed farrier of 70, an orphan of 19 who had been mucking a livery when this started, and a horsebreaker off a bankrupt outfit who had told her once that it could not be done. Verna Prine rode out ahead of them where the road came up out of the draw and put her hand flat on the black rock at the shoulder of the cut, and the sun was not up on it yet, and it was cold, and she got back on her horse and took them north. Fort Kilbourne came up out of the grass on the fourth morning, low and pale, and squared off against a sky the color of skimmed milk, and the 600 walked in through the north gate in a column that took 20 minutes to pass a fence post. They came in walking. That was the thing the men on the barracks porch noticed first and said out loud to each other, because horses that have made 90 miles up the Milk River Road generally come in with their heads down and their hocks filled, and these came in with their ears working and their feet clean. A dun gelding at the point swinging along like he had another 90 in him and did not much care who knew it. Verna Prine rode at the head of the column with a rope halter over her shoulder and her father's tally book buttoned inside her coat against her ribs, and she did not look at the barracks porch. Kit Mabry, 19 that spring and long in the leg now, held the left flank alone the way he had held the north gather alone the year before. Solomon Hake rode the drag with his sleeve pinned and his hat down, watching feet, always watching feet. Wade Kittredge rode where he had ridden for 5 years, a half step back and to her right, where a man can see what she sees a moment after she sees it. The post adjutant met her at the corrals with a paper in his hand and an apology already arranged on his face. There had been a wire, he said, out of rimfire 3 days ago, and another one behind it, and the substance of the two was that horses coming out of Bannerman County ought not to be let on the road at all this season, on account of the sickness, and that the board would be doing the army a service to turn them at the gate. Verna asked who had signed it. The adjutant looked at the paper as though he had hoped not to have to. Lyle Stannard, he said. She said nothing to that at all. She stepped down, loosened her cinch, and asked where the board wanted the string held, and the adjutant, who had braced himself for a scene and been handed a question about pens instead, pointed at the long empty corrals under the water tower and went away looking like a man who had lost an argument he never got to have. Captain Reuben Ash came out at 7 the next morning with 3 officers, a farrier sergeant, a measuring standard, and a clerk carrying a folding table, and the first words he said to her were not about the wire. He said, "You will want your own men on the gates, and I will want mine at the head. We will work until the light quits and start again at first light. If a horse is refused, I will say why out loud once, and we will not argue it." She said that suited her. Then he took off his gloves, laid them on the folding table, and read the specifications aloud, because it was his practice to read them aloud in front of the cellar so that nobody could say afterward that the goalposts had wandered. Geldings only, he read, aged 4 to 8 years, mouth to be the judge and not the seller. 15 hands to 16 hands at the withers, measured under the standard, no allowance for a horse standing proud. Sound in wind and limb, wind tried at the trot and the gallop, limb tried on the hard ground and not the soft. Halter broke and gentle to handle, catchable in the open, quiet to a stranger's hand on any part of him, quiet to a saddle, quiet to a man mounting from either side, certified free of glanders by the eye of the stock inspector and by the record of where the animal has stood and what water he has drunk. And the board ceiling, he read, is $150 a head, and the board does not bargain upward for any reason whatever. He folded the paper and put it in his breast pocket. Then he said the only unofficial sentence he said in 2 days. He said he had read that list aloud in the territory for 6 years and had never yet finished a string without a refusal, and that he wished her luck and did not expect it to matter. They started with the dun. The farrier sergeant ran a hand down him and put him under the standard, and the clerk wrote what the standard said. And the sergeant read the mouth and said 5, coming 6, and the clerk wrote that. A trooper the men called Neely swung up on him bareback with a hackamore and took him out around the corral at a walk, a trot, and a long, easy run down the fence line and brought him back, and stepped off him on the wrong side on purpose, dropping down off the right the way no horse is ever taught to expect, and the dun stood with one ear back and one ear on Neely and did not move a foot. Ash watched that. He did not write anything, and he did not say anything. He nodded at the clerk, and the clerk wrote accepted, and the gateman swung the gate, and the second horse came up. That was the whole of it, 600 times over 2 days, in the flat white light, with the water tower's shadow crawling around the corrals like the hand of a clock. Hands measured at the withers, mouths red for age, wind tried, hocks felt, feet lifted one by a farrier who had made his living finding the thing a seller had hidden, a trooper, on and off, from the left side and from the right, and a man walking up behind each horse's blind quarter with a bucket swinging in his hand to see what he would do about it, and what they did about it was nothing. They stood, every single head standing quiet under a stranger's hand, 600 of them, because an orphan boy who had mucked a livery for his supper had sat in the dirt with them as weanlings, and a one-armed farrier had taught them that a hand coming toward a foot was the least interesting thing in the world. And a silent man had put the first ride on every one of them in a lava canyon with no fence around him but rock, and had never in 5 years lost his temper at a horse where she could see it, or, she thought, where she could not. Toward the end of the first afternoon, a sorrel came up with a hitch in him that Ash caught before the sergeant did, and Verna caught it before Ash. She cut him out of the line herself and put him through the gate on the far side without being asked. And Ash looked at her a moment and said, "That was a stone bruise. He would have passed." She said, "He would have limped in July." Ash wrote nothing down, but he said afterward to the officers, in the way of a man laying a fact on a table, that in 6 years no seller had ever pulled a horse out of his line before the board could. The light quit, and they started again at first light. It ended on the second afternoon, and it ended without ceremony, the way she had wanted it to and the way the fort had not expected. The last horse, a big plain brown with a nothing head and legs like church columns, went under the standard at 15-3, read 6 years old, ran his fence line, stood for Neely and for the bucket, and for a corporal who came at him from behind with a saddle blanket flapping, and the clerk wrote accepted, and then there was nothing left in the pen but dust, and the water tower's shadow gone, long. The clerk went down his columns with his pen tip, twice, because Ash asked him to do it twice. 600 head accepted, not one refused. Ash stood looking at the paper for longer than a man needs to read a number. Then he said quietly to the officer beside him, and not to her, that he had never passed a string entire, and had not believed he would live to. He came over to the rail where she stood with both hands flat on it, and he asked her price. Everything she had done since April of 1884 had been walking toward that question, and it took her 4 words to answer it. She said, 140. The officer beside Ash made a small sound. Ash did not. He looked at her the way the farrier sergeant had looked at feet, because she could have said 150, and he would have paid 150, and every man at that rail knew it, and she knew that they knew it, and she had counted that in before she ever pointed the string north. She was not selling him 1 string. She was selling him the next 20 years, and a man who has to explain to Washington why he paid the ceiling remembers the seller who did not make him explain anything. Ash took out a pencil and did the arithmetic on the back of the clerk's tally sheet where anybody could watch him do it, and then he said it out loud, once, in the voice he used for the specifications. 600 head at $140 a head, $84,000. He looked at the figure. That is the largest single purchase of stock ever made in this territory, he said. By a good deal. He signed. The clerk countersigned, and the paymaster's man was sent for, and word went along the barracks porch, and men came out to look at the corrals. Not at her, at the horses, which was the only compliment she wanted, and the only one she would have believed. She did not smile. She did not shout. She took out the brass-cornered book, licked the pencil, and wrote the line in the same flat hand she had used for the first mare in the trap in the summer of 1884, the date, 600 head, the price, the buyer, the post. Then she closed the book and buttoned it back inside her coat. While the board tallied and the clerk's pen scratched and the corrals emptied one gate at a time, she went and stood at the fence with Wade, who had been at the fence the whole 2 days and had not come nearer than that. The sun was going, and the water tower had a red edge on it. He had his hat in his hand. He said, "They will be all day counting." She looked out at the 600 spreading out in the Army's grass, and she said at once, flat and quiet, to him and to nobody else. "They did not sell me 41 mares for $9, she said. They sold me everything they had never bothered to look at. He turned his head and looked at the side of her face, and then looked back at the horses, and something behind the flat of his face adjusted, and he did not say anything, and she had not expected him to. The bets came due afterward, one at a time, the way debts do. In November of that year, the territory stopped being a territory. The papers came through on the train, and the town fired an anvil at the depot, and there was a dance in the freight yard. And from then on the road ran through the state of Montana, and Verna Prine did not think about it twice, because the grass had not changed, and neither had the rock. What had changed was the freight yard. The Army took delivery of the second string that autumn out of the railhead by rail, and the cars stood on the spur 2 days being loaded. And the whole town came down to watch 180 head walk up a chute without one of them fighting it. Harlan Voigt stood at the rail. He was thicker in the neck and grayer, and he had lost money on horses for 5 years running the way a man does when the buyers stop caring what he says. He waited until she came past the chute with the loading tally in her hand. And then he took his hat off, which she had never seen him do, and said it in front of the same men he had said the other thing in front of, which was the only thing that made it worth anything. "I bet 2 weeks," he said, in front of everybody. "I was wrong about you, and I have been wrong out loud for 5 years, and I would like work." She could have made him say more. The whole rail was quiet, waiting to see if she would. She looked at him about as long as it takes to look at a horse's mouth, and she said, "Can you break a 4-horse hitch to a grader?" He said he could. She said, "40 a month and found, same as every man out there. Hake will tell you where to sleep." And that was the end of it. She did not make him say it twice, and she never mentioned it again, and Voigt worked the greater remudas for 11 years and was, in the flat opinion of the men who worked beside him, worth every dollar. Ezra Tulls came in his own building, at his own window, with ink on his cuffs. The deposit went in on a Tuesday, the Army's draft endorsed, and laid on the marble in front of him. And he had to write the $9 into his own book in his own hand, the same hand that had written the other line 5 years back. He wrote it. Then he set the pen in the tray, and he took his spectacles off, which for Tull was a considerable display of feeling, and he said, "I bet 1 winter. I wrote you up as of no value. Both of those are in my own hand, and I cannot rub either one out." He put the spectacles back on. "I was wrong about this. It was smart, and I did not see it, and I have never in my life been so glad to be wrong on paper." He turned the book around so she could read the figure. She read it, and nodded, and asked him what his rate was on a note of $18,000, because there was bottomland coming on the block and she meant to have it. And Tull, who had braced himself for gloating, laughed out loud for the first time in anyone's memory and reached for the rate book. The bottomland came on the block in the spring of 1890. The broken bit had gone into the sickness year with $140,000 of stock crowded on one trough and had come out the far side with a name, a stockyard, a hay meadow, and paper the bank could not carry any longer. Nobody was surprised when the paper was cried. Everybody was surprised who bought it. She bought the whole of it, the deeded bottomland, the railhead stockyard with its pens and its chutes and its scale, and the name, which she never used again for anything, and which hangs to this day on a plank over a shed door where it does no harm to anybody. She paid what it was worth and not a dollar less, which Tull told her was foolish and which she did not argue about. Then she rode down to the stockyard, where 11 men were standing around waiting to be told to go, and told them the opposite. Every man kept his job at his wage. The yard boss stayed yard boss. The two who had ridden the North Rim in the summer of 1887 and taken up 112 head of her unbranded stock under the estray law stayed as well, at the same wage as everybody else, and she never said a word to either of them about it as long as she lived, and one of them was still working that scale when she was in her 60s. Then she went and found Lyle Stannard. He was sitting on the top rail of an empty pen with his fine pale hat upside down in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. He was past 60 by then. The silver beard was white. She came and stood at the rail below him, and neither of them said anything for a while, and a Northern Pacific engine worked back and forth in the yard behind them. She told him she wanted a man to run the bottomland who understood hay and hired help and knew the county, and that the wage was whatever he cared to name, and that she was asking because there was not a better manager of ground within 200 miles, and she was not in the business of pretending otherwise. He took his time. Then he said, "No, thank you." I would take it, and I would be no good at it, because I would be standing in my own yard taking your orders, and a man my age does not learn that, and I would end by cheating you out of pure vanity and hating myself for it. He turned the hat another quarter. "You are the first person who has offered me anything since the inspector came," he said. "I will remember that, and I will not take it." And then he gave her the only thing he had left to give, and he gave it plainly, sitting on the rail in his shirt sleeves with his hat in his hands, and nobody by to hear it but her. "I looked at that rock for 30 years, he said. "Every spring I rode the North Road, and I looked at the cinders out my right stirrup, and I told anybody who asked that there was nothing up there but black rock and coyotes. And I said it with authority, because I have been right about horses in this country since before you were married. I never once got down off my horse and put my hand on it." He looked at her. That is the whole of it. That is the entire difference between us, and it took me until I was ruined to see it, and I would be obliged if you would not tell me it was luck, because I would rather it was not. She did not tell him it was luck. She said the trough was the thing, not the rock. He said the trough was the thing, and nodded, and that was the last conversation of any substance the two of them ever had. He lived out his years in the hotel's front rooms, respected to the end, consulted by young men about wind and bone, asked to judge the county stock show 4 times, and he judged it fairly, and he was never rich again. It was on the rim above the North Draw, the summer after the fort, at dusk, with a light going amber over the breaks and the bands coming down to water in long strings, that the door Wade Kittredge had kept shut for 5 years came open once and not very far. They had been counting. That was all they had been doing, sitting the horses on the rim while the bands came in, her calling and him marking, a thing they had done 100 times. Then the counting was finished, and neither of them moved to go. He said, "I have had a thing to say for about 4 years." She waited. The wind came up the draw and took the dust off the water, and the horses down there made the noise horses make coming off grass onto water. And Wade Kittredge, who had told her in the first week that it could not be done, and had never once said he was wrong because he had spent 5 years saying it with his hands instead, did not say the thing. She watched him not say it. Then he raised his hand, an inch, maybe 2, no more than that, the smallest motion she had ever seen a man make, and he reached over and tucked a strand of hair that had come loose back up under the brim of her hat and took his hand away. And she said yes. He looked at her. He had not asked her anything. He never did ask her, not that summer and not the summer after and not in the 40 years that followed, and he never needed to. And there was never a day either of them was confused about what had been answered on that rim. He got down off his horse. He took his hat off and held it against his chest with both hands and stood a half-step back of her stirrup while she looked out at her own country coming down to water in the amber light. And that is the whole of the romance. And it was enough for the two of them, and neither ever asked the other for more. By the autumn of 1893 there were 4,100 head of horses wearing the 9 on the left hip. They ran across 90,000 acres of open range that no man could enter with stock and stay, because the range was held by 11,000 deeded acres and 2 waters, and whoever holds the water holds the country, and she had filed on that water in 1885 while the town was still laughing and the filing fee was cheap. The Army contract was renewed twice. Captain Ash bought his geldings out of the cinders every season he stayed at the post, and when he was ordered east, he wrote a letter about the string to his successor, and the successor kept it and bought the same way. The stage line took every harness horse she could break until the stage line quit, and then the railroad took them, and then the graders, and then the freighters, and there were seasons she could not breed fast enough to fill the paper on her own desk. The tax roll for the county that year listed the $9 horse company at $260,000, the largest single assessment in Bannerman County, larger than the bank, larger than the mill, larger than the whole of the town's business district added together and taxed as one. Kit Membry was 23 and her range boss, with 9 men under him and any horse on the place he cared to throw a leg over, and he had not slept in a livery since he was 14. Solomon Hakes 40 days apart, separate water, separate buckets and bits, burned bedding, lime, had been printed as a single sheet by the Territorial Stock Board in the sickness year and went on being printed by the State Board afterward, and it hung nailed inside the door of every livery from the Yellowstone to the line. And the old men called it the Hake sheet. And Hecky himself said once that it was a peculiar thing to be famous for something a woman's father had taught her. Bishop died in the grass that spring at 18 years old, and they buried him on the rim above the north draw where he had stood his mares for 9 years. The town drew her wages, 41 men that autumn, on the ranch and the yard and the hay meadows, and the dry goods and the hotel and the freight line lived off them, and the county's men had long since quit saying the widow and started saying the $9 the way a man says a landmark. The rail at the freight yard where the ring used to stand and cry stock was worn smooth in a long pale groove by 30 years of forearms, and it was the same rail she had put both hands flat on in April of 1884. The auctioneer was still on the box. He was old now, and thin and had to be helped up, but his voice was the same voice that had banged for quiet on the day the whole ring laughed. He cried her stock 4 times a year, and he cried it proud, and he had got into the habit of opening every sale with a line about the outfit whose horses these were, and the line always started with the 2 words that in that county needed no explaining at all. And the sale book from that April was still in the county's cupboard, bound in canvas, and a clerk's line was still in it in Ezra Toll's own hand, in ink gone brown, wild scrub, 41 head, ungathered, of no value. Nobody ever crossed it out. She would not let them. On an evening in the autumn of 1893, 42 years old, with ash coming in at her temples under the flat-brimmed hat, Verna Prine rode out alone on the north rim after the bands were watered and the men had gone in, and got down, and crouched and put her hand flat on the black lava rock the way she had on the evening before she bid. The sun had been gone a good while. The rock was still warm. 4,100 head, and every one of them standing on ground a whole county had ridden past for 30 years with their eyes on the road. The men who laughed at the rail were dead, or drawing her wages, or sitting in the hotel window, and their names went into the ground with them. The 9 went on the left hip of every horse foaled in that rock for 60 years after she was buried on the rim beside her stud, and it is burned there yet.